Chapter 17. The Girl on the Bed of Leaves. After what seemed like an eternity of being locked in almost total darkness, Sarah Maynard realized she was being rescued. It was a moment she would never forget. She recalled later, "I heard someone come into the house and they yelled, 'Get down, get down.' Then they came downstairs and I think they kept saying, 'I think she's here.' And then a whole bunch of guys came down, and at first I thought they were bad guys, but then I saw the helmets on them, and I knew they were saving me." When the shock of seeing Sarah bound and lying on a bed of leaves wore off, both Sergeant Troy Glazier and Detective Craig Feeney proceeded to assist her. Glazier recalled, "Once it was apparent she was not in any immediate danger, I slowed everything down and had an officer go upstairs to get a camera before we released her from her bonds. A minute later, Feeney took photos of Sarah and how she was bound before we released her. Other officers cleared the rest of the basement, and I moved two large black trash bags that felt like they had leaves in them from the doorway to the right of where the female was." Glazier debated getting onto a ledge that seemed to lead to a crawl space, but decided against it because there were some scuff marks in the fine dirt that appeared to have been made by a shoe. In other words, he did not want to disturb the shoe prints in case they were important. "Feeney and I released the female from the rope that she was bound with," Glazier recounted. "I untied the knots of the yellow rope that held her hands. Feeney cut the rope to her ankles to preserve the knots. Once she was free, we helped her stand up. She had on a white plastic bag that had holes cut out for her legs, so that she was wearing like a makeshift diaper. It appeared that she had urinated in her jeans because they were wet from her waist to halfway down her knees." For his part, Feeney remembered, "The girl had brown jersey gloves on her hands, and they were duct taped. Her hands were tied up with a yellow rope, and so were her ankles. I identified who we were and asked if she was okay. The girl advised that she was okay." Sarah's first words to the officers took them completely by surprise. She said, "I have to get to school." Despite everything that had happened, Sarah was afraid that she would be in trouble for missing so many days of school. Detective Feeney assured her that she didn't need to go to school right away. Then, he reported, after the photographs were taken, the girl asked if the suspect was secured so he couldn't hurt her. They assured her that he was. Then she said, "He cut my finger with a knife. He usually kept me gagged, and he was going to release me before Christmas." Feeney asked her if she knew where anyone else was, meaning Tina, Cody, or Stephanie, and Sarah said that she didn't know, but she thought the man who had held her captive had killed her dog. Feeney helped Sarah get up, and she was, of course, still disoriented from having been in the dark for so long. Sergeant Glazier recalled, "We told her again that she was safe and that the sheriff's office was handling the investigation and that they would be speaking with her shortly about what happened. We asked her if there had been anyone else at the residence besides her and the suspect that she knew about. She said no and believed it had just been the two of them there, although she was not as certain if her captor had someone outside the house helping him." Glazier continued, "The suspect was taken from the residence area and secured in a KCSO cruiser. We called for a medic unit to respond to check on Sarah and transport her to the Knox County Hospital, KCH. We helped her upstairs and stayed with her in the living room until the medics came in with a stretcher. Sarah was briefly checked by the medics and placed on the stretcher and covered with a blanket. She was taken out and transported to KCH for treatment and evaluation. The suspect was transported to KCSO." Special Agent Joe Dietz arrived at Matthew Hoffman's house just as Sarah was being led up the stairs from the basement. Dietz accompanied her to Knox County Hospital. As they rode together to the hospital in the back of the ambulance, he monitored her treatment and asked her some questions about her abduction and captivity. Sarah remembered later how strange it felt to her to actually be speaking to someone other than the man who had abducted her. She said, "I was glad they were helping me, but it was kind of freaky talking to anyone at the time." As yet, she didn't even know Hoffman's name. She was sure she had never seen him before and couldn't imagine why her family had been targeted. She was also having a hard time adjusting to all the light. She had been in almost total darkness for so long that daylight seemed dazzling to her eyes. Sarah told Dietz that she and her brother had been attacked after entering their home on Wednesday when they got home from school. "I told the investigators that me and Cody saw the blood on the tile and there was nobody in there. We were like, oh my gosh, and then he came and snatched us." Sarah told Dietz that the man had tried to grab her, but she broke free and ran to her bedroom. She hadn't actually seen him kill Cody, but she was worried that Cody had not survived. Sarah said that the man came to her bedroom, grabbed her, and carried her down to the basement, where he used some available rope to tie her up. He then took her to the kitchen floor and left her there for a long time before taking her to Stephanie Sprang's Jeep and placing her inside of it. After a while, Sarah told them, he drove her to the Pipesville Road ball field parking lot, which she recognized, and she was left in the back seat of the Jeep, covered with blankets, for another long period of time. Later, the man came back, placed her in a different car, and drove her to the house where she was later found. Sarah told Dietz that she had been tied up most of the time and had spent some time in a bathroom and some in a closet before being transferred to the small dark area in the basement. She was vague about when these movements occurred because her sense of time had been eroded by this point. Sarah did say that the man would not tell her what had happened to her mother, brother, or Stephanie, but she suspected that he had killed all of them. In the hospital, BCI&I Special Agent Mark Kohler photographed the work gloves and duct tape that Hoffman had used on Sarah. Then Kohler took possession of several pieces of evidence, including a binding from Sarah's right wrist, a binding from her left wrist, a bag containing socks and boots, another bag containing her clothing, and a kit connected to sexual molestation collected during the nurse's examination of Sarah. Special Agent Dietz stayed with Sarah until Carrie Huffman, a caseworker from Ohio's Child and Family Services, and Tom Bumpus, the KCSO detective in charge of crimes against children, arrived. Shortly followed by Diana Oswalt, the victim advocate from the Knox County Prosecutor's Office. Diana Oswalt had been with many victims in Knox County, but had never been involved with anything like this. She'd come into her job by an unusual route, although she had always wanted to help people in need. Until the late 1990s, Oswalt had worked at banks in various capacities. She had moved from one position to another, then finally told her husband it was time for a new start. He agreed with her, and Oswalt put in an application to become a victim's advocate in Knox County. Oswalt's immediate concern for Sarah was to assure her that she was now safe and that the suspect could no longer hurt her. He was in jail and would not be getting back out. Sarah had some concerns that Matthew Hoffman had an accomplice, and Oswalt assured Sarah that even if that was true, she would be well protected now and nobody could hurt her. Messages were flying all over the place by early Sunday afternoon. Greg Borders was contacted about Sarah's safe recovery by KCSO. He phoned Captain Schaefer, wanting to know if he should go to the hospital. Sarah was told by authorities that her uncles, Tina's brothers, had arrived at the hospital and wanted to see her, but Sarah kept saying that she wanted her father, Larry Maynard. The only person she asked to see was her dad. Larry and his family were stunned when they got the news that Sarah was alive. His first thoughts were filled with elation. My daughter is alive. And then the implication of what he had just heard hit him hard. Nothing had been said about Cody, Tina, or Stephanie. What had happened to them? Were they alive as well? Larry hurried to the hospital. He recalled, "It was all surreal going into the place. I don't even know what I was thinking by that point. I was beyond thinking. I went into a room and there she was. We just both went over and hugged each other. We didn't say a word, just hugged each other as tightly as we could. I was crying like a baby. This went on for 10 or 15 minutes before we said anything." All day long there had been a mob of reporters swirling around the Maynard residence, KCSO headquarters, Matthew Hoffman's residence. Diana Oswalt did her best to help the Maynard family cope with the reporters and to shield them from the media onslaught coming in from all sides, though in many ways it was just as new to her as it was to the Maynards. Nothing of this magnitude had ever befallen any of them before. Later that day, Sunday, Sheriff David Barber held a press conference. He announced, "We have good news to report today. We have located and rescued Sarah Maynard at approximately 8 a.m. this morning. She was being held against her will, and she was in good condition with non-life-threatening injuries. She was taken to the hospital for evaluation. She has been interviewed somewhat. In the house with her was an individual from Mount Vernon. He is now in the Knox County Jail, currently charged with kidnapping. His name is Matthew J. Hoffman, and he is 30 years old. We believe Sarah was under the control of Mr. Hoffman since last Wednesday in one form or another and at one location or another." There were, of course, a lot of questions about Matthew Hoffman from reporters. To these, Sheriff Barber replied, "We are unsure at this time if Hoffman was acquainted with his family. That remains to be seen as the investigation continues. Mr. Hoffman does have a prior conviction in Colorado, for which he served prison time. Mr. Hoffman's residence on Columbus Road is currently being processed by the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation. It is being considered a crime scene and is treated as such." To a question about whether Tina, Cody, and Stephanie were dead, Barber answered, "As of right now, we have no one we are aware of who is deceased. Tomorrow, we hope DNA testing can begin. We have been assured that this will be considered a priority case by the BCI&I." After Matt Hoffman was arrested and Sarah Maynard was freed from her basement captivity, BCI&I agents began the long process of collecting, photographing, and cataloging the evidence at Matthew Hoffman's home. BCI&I Special Agent Gary Wilgus wrote later, "The residence was photographed as it was found, room by room, starting on the ground floor. I then photographed the basement area as it was found. At the bottom of the stairway just to the left was a hole cut through the block wall leading into a dark room where blankets and bedding had been placed on the leaf-covered floor." BCI&I agent George Staley Jr. was also at Hoffman's house and photographed the whole residence, room by room, placing numbered placards at each key area. Item number 1 was a pair of starter brand athletic shoes that had characteristics similar to the footwear impressions found in Tina Herman's house. Item 2 was a pair of boots that matched some of the other impressions found at the house. Item 3 was a camouflage t-shirt identical to the one the individual caught on the security camera tape had been wearing at Walmart around midnight on November 10th. The next item of significance, item 5, was a Canon PowerShot A470 camera found in a dresser drawer on the ground floor. The camera was later accessed and photographs of Sarah Maynard were identified on the camera. Those were photos of Sarah during her ordeal at Hoffman's house. Another item of importance, number 5.2, was a leather sap or blackjack found in the same dresser. And item 6 was a large SOG brand sheath-type knife, also found in the dresser drawer. Item 9 was a piece of rope found in the basement at the bottom of the stairway. Law enforcement officers later informed Staley that this piece of rope had been used to bind Sarah and had been cut by them to preserve the original knots. Other items included a roll of gray duct tape and a blue blanket that had been used to cover Sarah. Also in the basement area were a sweatshirt, 2 more blankets, a pillow, and more gray duct tape. 3 computers were found in various parts of the house, as well as $1,000 in cash stuffed inside an envelope. An LG brand flip phone was collected from the ground floor, a Casio flip phone from one kitchen drawer, and a Motorola flip phone from another. Though 2 of the most interesting items discovered in the residence were a bone and an apparent bloodstain, later testing would prove that neither came from a human.